Hey guys, today I'll show you an apocalyptic horror TV series named The Virus. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins at a sanatorium in a city's suburban area in South Korea. A fire broke out in the early hours of the morning. Firefighters rushed to the scene to rescue victims, but they found only one survivor left. The survivor was muttering incessantly that those who escaped were still alive. The injured person was then rushed to an ambulance for emergency treatment, coughing up blood all the while, and soon stopped breathing. 2 days later, a firefighter who had participated in the rescue operation suddenly collapsed and died. Even the ambulance driver met with an accident, bleeding from every orifice and dying suddenly while driving. Upon testing, it was found that all these people had died from a viral infection. After a quick investigation, the authority figured out the sanatorium where the fire had occurred was likely the source of the virus. Lee, an expert of the Disease Control Center of South Korea, immediately rushed to the sanatorium. Unfortunately, the fire was so intense that the entire facility had been burnt to a crisp. They searched all around but found no clues. Lee was perplexed. The fire had occurred in the early hours, and all the surveillance in the corridors had been damaged. As Lee was about to leave, he received a call from his subordinate, saying that the results of the virus test were out. Rushing to the hospital, Lee was shocked after hearing the report from his colleague. The deceased were infected with the bird flu virus. Lee couldn't help but question if there was a mistake, because the deceased firefighters had no contact with poultry and even showed symptoms of bleeding, which is not characteristic of bird flu. Just then, a doctor named Kim showed up and declared that the infection is indeed the bird flu virus. Previously, he discovered through testing that the newly emerged virus was very similar to avian flu, with only a small part mutated. This resulted in the new virus being far more destructive than before, as it actively attacked the organs of the infected. This was similar to the symptoms of poultry infected with bird flu. Lee asked if the avian flu treatment was useful, but Dr. Kim said it was of no use. From infection to outbreak, it only took 2 days, and the patient would die within 3 days. His colleague asked if the virus could be transmitted through the air, but Dr. Kim was somewhat depressed because all the subjects had died, and he could not confirm this now. Subsequently, Lee received reports one after another. A little girl, who had no connection with the sanatorium, died from the virus. Earlier, her mother had also died at home. Lee knew that the mutated virus had begun to spread, and he immediately reported to the higher-ups. Currently, 21 people, including firefighters who participated in the rescue of the sanatorium and their families, were infected. Among them, 17 people had died. Additionally, there were 12 people unrelated to the sanatorium who had died from the virus. Since no treatment method was found, the fatality rate was almost 100%. The government officials were puzzled, wondering how this virus spread. Also, no reports of bird flu had been received this year. Lee was only concerned about the results. He suggested that the control level should be raised as soon as possible, but his proposal was opposed by the higher-ups. They were worried that this would bring a negative impact to the city. Since the infected were effectively controlled, it means the situation was still within control. Upon hearing this, Lee exploded in anger, warning that the virus didn't differentiate between the rich and poor. If it spread, everybody would suffer too. The officials were so angry and pointedly told Lee's superior, the director of the CDC, to control his subordinate. The director called Lee out of the meeting room. After calming down Lee, he told him that the most urgent thing now was to control the virus. Also, they must keep it strictly confidential and not cause panic among the public. Lee wanted to say something else, but the director shouted at him to take his orders. Lee then returned to his office and immediately summoned his subordinates to assign tasks. The priority now was to find the source of the infection to prevent the virus from spreading. Lee divided them into several groups. After emphasizing that information about the virus absolutely could not be leaked, he began to assign tasks. These disease control personnel were rushing the clock. They sampled from poultry farms, vegetable markets, and supermarkets within a radius of 5 kilometers, centered on the sanatorium where the infected were. In addition, some people were investigating the roots of the infected before they died, so as to confirm if others were infected. Unfortunately, all the sample test results did not find the mutated virus. Lee had no choice but to find his director and suggest raising the control level again. However, the director said he could only carry out orders. The higher-ups would not agree to Lee's request. All he could do was assign more personnel to Lee. One of the personnel was one who had dealt with international infection incidents and was considered a capable officer. The decisive one immediately came to report, but Lee didn't pay special attention because he was troubled at the moment. Besides the sanatorium, no mutated viruses were found in poultry anywhere nearby. The investigation was at a standstill. At this time, the newly arrived one suggested that the infection could possibly be from humans since they couldn't find its source. This gave Lee a hint. Since the sanatorium was managed in a closed manner, the patients and staff inside were unlikely to be the source of infection. Now, the most suspicious were outsiders. Lee immediately came up with an idea. He took one to the security company of the sanatorium. Even though the surveillance equipment was damaged, the security company would definitely have automatically uploaded backup footage. While the staff were fetching the footage, at that moment, Lee stepped outside alone, struggling over whether or not to call his ex-wife to warn her about the virus. His daughter had died from a virus infection a few years ago, causing his marriage to fall apart. But he hesitated, and in the end, he didn't make the call. The group quickly retrieved the surveillance footage from the sanatorium, but the file was corrupted and the screen was filled with static. Lee brought the tape back to the office and asked the IT girl to repair it. Unfortunately, the file was too damaged and impossible to recover. Thankfully, she was able to fix the sanatorium's archived computer and discovered something strange. The sanatorium's records showed that there were only 15 patients and staff members, but 17 bodies were found that day. This indicated that outsiders had indeed entered the sanatorium. Lee wondered if there had been 18 people in the sanatorium when the fire started, and what if the extra person escaped and spread the virus to those 12 unrelated infected individuals? Everyone was stunned by his theory. If Lee was right, the consequences would be dire. Unfortunately, the reality was exactly as Lee had speculated. It turns out that a hooded man was a walking plague spreader. He sat on a bus and coughed lightly, and the mother and daughter sitting next to him were infected with the mutated virus. 2 days later, the mother died from internal bleeding, and the little girl also died in the hospital despite efforts to save her. However, the hooded man showed no symptoms of infection. He likely had natural immunity. He spent his days walking on busy streets, and within 2 days, 12 innocent people had been infected and died. One day, before he returned to his dormitory, he went to a supermarket to buy some food and happened to run into Lee's ex-wife. He couldn't help but sneeze, and it was likely she was infected as well. Later, the hooded man returned to his dormitory. His roommate mentioned that he had found a part-time job for him at an internet cafe, and he was to report to work the next day. The hooded man gratefully nodded, and soon after, his roommate also started to cough violently. On the other side, Lee ran into trouble again. News had published information on the mutated virus. Lee immediately suspected it was the doing of a reporter. Just a few days ago, when Lee was investigating the sanatorium, the reporter was there too, but was chased away by Lee. Furious, Lee demanded the reporter to take down the article immediately. He promised him the first scoop on any future developments, and only then did the reporter comply. Luckily, the report was removed quickly enough to prevent the news about the mutated virus from spreading. Lee knew time was of the essence and spent the night analyzing the case. He marked the approximate locations of the 12 unrelated infected individuals and connected them with lines. One blurted out, saying that it seemed like a bus route. Everything fell into place for Lee. He immediately asked the IT girl to pull up the bus route map and look for passenger information from that time frame. If they used a bus card, it could be traced. Sure enough, 5 of the infected individuals had taken bus number 4 within the same time frame. Lee led a team to the bus company to inquire about the bus. The person in charge thought for a moment and told them that the driver of bus number 4 hadn't been to work for several days and wasn't answering his phone. Lee realized they had a serious problem. Indeed, when he and the disease control team arrived at the bus driver's house, they found that he had been dead for some time. Lee then asked the IT girl to pull up the bus surveillance footage. They finally found footage of the infected mother and daughter. One also recognized 3 other people on the bus who were on the list of deceased infected individuals. They could now confirm that the patient 0 who had escaped from the sanatorium was on the same bus, but with so many people, they couldn't identify who exactly it was. Just then, Lee received a report saying that there was another group infection incident near a residential area. 10 severely ill patients had been sent to the hospital, and the entire area was quickly quarantined. The onlookers, unaware of the severity of the virus, were all standing around watching, some even filming the scene. The news of the virus could no longer be concealed, and multiple news outlets reported on the incident. Lee felt like he was at his wit's end. Fortunately, the IT girl found another important lead. She pulled up surveillance footage from around the infected area and accidentally spotted the hooded man withdrawing money at a bank. He had also appeared on the infected bus before, indicating that the virus carrier might indeed be this man. What's more, the two surveillance footages were 4 days apart, and since the hooded man was still alive, it suggested he was immune to the virus. At this point, the hooded man was at a crowded subway station, preparing to go to the internet cafe for his part-time job, totally unaware of the disaster he was about to bring to the whole city. Lee figures out the hooded man as the source of the virus, but they can't identify him or find him out right away. Lee was called in for an update on the current progress, but the director is not satisfied with that. The media outside is swarming, and people even gather at the door of the control center, demanding answers from the authority. Lee has no choice but to reveal the possible existence of antibodies in the hooded man, which calms the director. They promise to try to hold off the media to buy him some time. At this time, Lee's assistant, Won, finds some crucial information. The head of the virology department at the Central City Hospital had once been researching a super vaccine against avian flu variants. Although the research was forced to stop 2 years ago, the lab might still hold the mutated virus. Knowing that many viral disasters internationally have been caused by lab leaks, Lee decides to investigate the hospital. When he and Won arrive, they encounter a patient's son causing a fuss. His mother has been infected with the mutated virus, and he wants to see her one last time. Lee immediately calls security to drive away the man who is causing the disturbance, because there's a chance they could be carrying the virus, and visiting could increase the risk of infection. Won doesn't understand, arguing that the patient had the right to see her family one last time. As they argue, Dr. Kim comes out and says the man has been tested and does not carry the mutated virus. He then arranges for the man to put on protective clothing to see his mother one last time. At this time, Dr. Kim's superior, Dr. Yoon, arrives in the office. Won asks if they have researched super antibodies. Dr. Yoon proudly says this is a groundbreaking research that could immunize against all avian flu mutations, but the experiment was halted 2 years ago. Dr. Kim seems reluctant to discuss the matter and leaves after a brief greeting. Won immediately follows him. Dr. Kim says he produced the variant virus used in the experiment, and Won can see any data she wants. But Dr. Yoon is cagey and refuses to reveal any information about the experiment, even the reason for its termination. With no other options, Lee prepares to leave the hospital. At the elevator, he happens to meet an emergency patient who is infected. Lee accidentally hears the doctors call out the patient's name and is greatly surprised, rushing forward. It turns out that the patient is Lee's ex-wife. He wants to rush into the emergency room, but is stopped by the medical staff. Now he understands how the son of the patient felt earlier. Fortunately, Lee was prepared. After his daughter died from a virus infection 3 years ago, he had the Disease Control Center specially store a dose of an antiviral drug, specifically his ex-wife's T lymphocytes, which are effective against various viruses. After receiving the drug from his colleague, Lee hurriedly took it to the emergency room. The staff, having no better treatment option, followed Lee's suggestion and administered the drug to his ex-wife. However, they could not guarantee its effectiveness and told Lee to be prepared for any outcome. Lee still had feelings for his ex-wife. He had intended to warn her about the new virus, but after much hesitation, he never made the call previously. At this point, Lee was both heartbroken and guilt-ridden. He went to the restroom to calm himself down. Suddenly, he received a call from a subordinate reporting another infection case. Given his current state, Lee asked his team to confirm the situation. When the disease control team entered the room, they found a man lying on the floor, blood oozing from his orifices. His death was terrifying. Given his condition, they were sure he was infected with the same mutated virus. According to the deceased man's girlfriend, he had stayed in his dormitory the whole time, only hosting a friend who was hiding from loan sharks for a few days. The disease control center team speculated that the friend might have passed the virus to the deceased, but the friend was still fine after a few days, which led them to suspect that this friend might be the exact virus host they'd been looking for. The girlfriend then informed them that the host had gone to a subway station to apply for a part-time job. One of the team members took out the deceased's phone, saying they needed to contact Lee as soon as possible. At this point, Lee, dressed in protective gear, was next to his infected ex-wife. Looking at her condition, it seemed the drug had not worked on her. Lee was determined to save her and asked if she had been in contact with any strangers recently. His ex-wife recalled encountering a hooded man who sneezed at the supermarket the day before. Lee showed her a picture of the host. Although she said the photo was a bit blurry, she thought the man looked similar. Just then, Lee received a call from his subordinate, saying that the host was at the subway station. Lee hung up the phone and prepared to head to the subway station immediately. He knew that catching the virus host was the only hope for his wife's treatment. He asked his assistant one to seek support from the director and asked the IT girl to check the surveillance around the subway station. The director was very supportive. Upon hearing that the host was heading to the subway station, he immediately sent some armed personnel to catch him. One then helped the IT girl with the surveillance. Unfortunately, the crowd at the subway station was too dense. Finding the host among the numerous surveillances was a huge challenge. At this point, Lee had already reached the subway station and took the phone of the deceased roommate of the hooded man. He planned to split up with his colleague to search for the person. Not long after, Lee received a call from the IT girl. They had found the target through surveillance. The target was at a public phone booth in a business area. It turned out the target's roommate had set him up with a part-time job, but after waiting at the meeting spot for a long time, no one came. As a result, the target was preparing to call his roommate at that time. Once Lee knew the target's whereabouts, he hurriedly ran towards the location. Time was of the essence, and he could no longer wait for backup. However, he could never expect that the arriving backup had to cancel their mission under the director's order. They were instructed not to stop at the station when passing by, to circle around and return to base. It turned out a counselor had just called, berating the director, saying that the station was the busiest area and deploying a biohazard team would cause terrible implications. It was a critical period for the election, and he threatened if the director even wanted his job. The director had no choice but to withdraw the backup team. At this time, Lee had reached the phone booth. Suddenly, the phone in his hand rang. He knew it was the target calling and did not answer, instead sneaking closer to the target. The hooded man, not far off, heard the phone ring, turned his head and saw Lee staring at him. He casually asked where his roommate was. Sensing something off, the man dropped the phone and ran. Lee chased after him while contacting his colleague to intercept. But there were too many people on the scene. Lee was even stopped by a foreigner asking for directions. Moreover, the hooded man thought Lee was his debt collector and ran even faster. In the end, he managed to shake off Lee and his colleague. Soon after, the counselor quickly learned they had not captured the target. He did not show any panic, but in front of his subordinates, he kept emphasizing they must keep the virus outbreak a secret, and the death of the previously infected residents should be attributed to a gas leak. Elsewhere, Lee hadn't given up on finding the target. He realized the hooded man did not know his roommate was dead and might return to the temporary dormitory, so he immediately drove with his colleague towards there. True enough, the target had already reached the vicinity of the dormitory, but after seeing the police at the entrance, he turned and left. Soon, Lee also saw the police at the entrance. Knowing the target would not return to the dormitory, he drove around the nearby area to search and finally spotted the wandering target. Lee got out of the car and told his colleague to wait on the main road. He handed him a mask and told him to be very careful. Afterwards, Lee sprinted and finally caught up with the hooded man. When the man tried to escape, Lee quickened his pace and finally caught him with a flying tackle. But the man fiercely resisted, kicking off Lee's mask and tried to run again. Lee hurriedly called out that his roommate was dead and he was not here to collect his debt. Lee then showed his credentials and told the man that he was carrying a mutant virus that had killed many people. Hearing this, the man panicked even more, shouting that Lee was lying and started running again. Lee had no choice but to keep chasing. As they crossed a main road, Lee was accidentally hit by a car. He watched helplessly as the target escaped in a vehicle. At this point, one also arrived at the scene, stopping Lee, who was still eager to continue the chase. She warned him that he might also be infected without any protective measures and could also endanger his colleagues. These words reminded Lee that during his scuffle with the host, his mask had fallen off. He stopped his colleague and told him to hail a cab and leave. Lee then drove alone in the direction the host had fled for a while, but he couldn't spot him. Although Lee was flustered, he knew that he needed to confirm whether he had been infected. So he returned to the disease control center, asking his subordinates to maintain a distance. He then locked himself in the office, drew a tube of blood from himself, and asked his colleague to send it to the lab for testing. In the meantime, he started to stitch up his wounds. However, as an employee of the disease control center, he couldn't abandon his duties. He arranged for his subordinates over the phone to continue the search for the host. They couldn't let the virus host wander around, allowing the virus to spread further. Especially given that a widespread infection event might occur at the subway station, they needed to be well prepared. Meanwhile, the host had hailed a taxi and arrived at a deserted street. Recalling Lee's words and that he had once been caught and studied in a sanatorium, he mustered the courage to go to a hospital for a full examination. However, the hospital was too busy. The doctor only gave him a brief look over and told him it was just a common cold and to take some medicine at home. The host wanted to insist on a blood test, but the doctor was called away. While waiting, the host noticed a foreigner not far away and instantly remembered that this person had helped him stall Lee at the subway station. Sensing something off, he slipped out of the hospital. True enough, it turns out this foreigner was not just a passerby. Upon realizing the host was gone, he also came to search for him. Luckily, the host was quick-witted and hid in an ambulance, successfully escaping the scene. Through the ambulance window, he saw that there was more than one foreigner chasing after him. To his surprise, the taxi driver who had previously driven the host was also with them. Meanwhile, Lee was still in his office, waiting for the test results. Not long after, his subordinate rushed in with the test results. The results were negative. Lee breathed a sigh of relief. On the other side, one, using the surveillance footage from last night's car, uncovered a suspicious lead. The taxi that struck Lee was not due to a random accident. Instead, it seemed to deliberately swerve to hit him, as if trying to help the host escape. Additionally, the colleague found that the host had indeed been in the same burned-down sanatorium and had been sold there by a loan shark. Upon this finding, Lee immediately went to the loan shark company. Once they revealed their identities, they asked if anyone remembered the hooded man. The thug was surprised, asking why they were looking for a dead person. Lee immediately realized there was more to the story, asking him how he knew the host was dead. Just then, the boss came forward and told Lee that the sanatorium's head had once asked them to find homeless people who had no family or friends and who wouldn't be reported missing to be sent to the sanatorium. However, he claimed that he didn't know what they were used for. Lee realized that there was an even bigger conspiracy hidden beneath. He warned the boss to stay away from the virus host and to contact the disease control center immediately if they found him. Afterwards, Lee went to the Central City Hospital, intending to visit his infected ex-wife. There, he unexpectedly encountered another scene. Another patient was brought in with the virus, and he was a doctor. Surveillance footage showed that the doctor had attended to the virus host the day before, and his behavior seemed to indicate that he was avoiding a foreigner. Lee also remembered this man. He was the one who previously blocked him from catching the host at the subway station. Lee was curious as to why he would help the host escape. More and more evidence was showing that this virus outbreak was not a simple accident. Meanwhile, the host was wandering on the street, recalling the scene of the fire at the sanatorium. The tightly locked room was suddenly opened, allowing him to escape from the burning sanatorium. Just as he finished recalling this, the homeless man who had been next to him was suddenly motionless. Just the night before, he had been fine, even sharing a piece of expired bread with the host. But now, he was also turned into a cold corpse. The host finally confirmed that he was indeed carrying the virus. He didn't want to harm anyone else, so he voluntarily came to the disease control center, hoping that Lee could help him atone. Lee quickly evacuated the staff from the hall and disinfected every corner. He agreed to the host's request and planned to take him to the Central City Hospital for antibody testing. If all goes well, they could develop a cure and vaccine. Lee knew the host was just a victim of a conspiracy and helped him into an ambulance, promising that once the examination was over, he hoped the host could tell everything about the sanatorium. The host was filled with fear at the mention of this, obviously a bad memory. Then Lee got into the ambulance. Before leaving, Lee called Dr. Kim to prepare for their arrival. Little did they know, as they arrived at a crossroad, a cement truck suddenly came speeding towards them while ignoring the traffic light. Fortunately, Lee and his colleague were unharmed, but the host in the cargo box had fallen into a coma, covered in blood. He needed to be rushed to the hospital for emergency treatment. The colleague quickly called for backup. Subordinates from the disease control center were the first to arrive at the scene. They moved the injured host to another ambulance, planning to rush to the center hospital immediately. By then, a large number of journalists had gathered at the hospital entrance because news of the virus outbreak had spread, and the government had not yet released the truth. One and the team kept the journalists outside, preparing to bring the host into the hospital, but were stopped by the guards. Dr. Kim stepped forward to explain that this was the hospital's decision. The host's infectious risk was very high, and no surgeon was willing to operate on him. Even the doctor who had been infected by him was already dead. At this moment, Lee shouted that he would perform the surgery. He had been a surgeon before and could find someone to direct the operation via surveillance. Dr. Kim finally agreed to let them pass. But before they could get to the operating room, Dr. Yoon suddenly appeared and said that he wanted to extract the host's bone marrow first. His main concern was whether the host's body carried antibodies, which would be more conducive to virus drug research. However, Lee ignored him, prioritizing saving lives. After finally getting the host into the operating room, Lee felt unwell. It seemed that he was also seriously injured in the car accident. Lee knew he couldn't give up now, so he struggled and walked into the surgery room, finding Dr. Yoon extracting the host's blood. He had to suppress his anger, and under the guidance of an expert surgeon outside, began to operate on the host. Meanwhile, through blood oxygen tests on the host, Dr. Yoon finally confirmed that his body indeed contained antibodies. He immediately ran to the surveillance room to cheer on Lee, urging him to save the host. But Lee, already injured, and after several hours of surgery, fainted on the operating table. Dr. Yoon knew the operation couldn't be interrupted, so he ordered the expert surgeon to continue operating on the host. After the surgery, the host finally pulled through the critical period, narrowly escaping death. By this time, Lee had regained consciousness. His body was fine, except for some minor fractures. Lee gratefully came to his ex-wife's hospital room. She had survived for 5 days with the help of T-cells. Dr. Kim stated that as long as the antibody drug came out, she had a high chance of being cured. There were also some infected people in the hospital, and the virus in their bodies was slowly evolving, causing the incubation period to lengthen. After hearing that the host had woken up, Lee immediately found him to inquire about his experience at the sanatorium. It's then revealed that after the host was abducted by loan sharks and taken to the sanatorium, he was confined in a room where he was administered an unknown serum and had a significant amount of blood drawn. It seemed like he was put under a human experiment. Lee grew more convinced that someone was intentionally spreading the virus, so he returned to the disease control center. At this point, the colleague had already found some clues. The car accident at the intersection was clearly deliberate, and the driver had abandoned his vehicle and fled the scene. Although he was wearing a hat, his facial features resembled those of the taxi driver who had hit Lee. This suggests that the people trying to kill the host and help him escape are the same group. Apparently, they intended to hide the truth that they had manufactured the virus through human experimentation. The colleague speculated whether it could be a pharmaceutical company intending to profit from vaccine sales. One didn't agree with it, as the virus's fatality rate was too high for it to spread widely. Lee recalled what Dr. Kim had said. The virus was slowly adapting to the human body, indicating the potential for widespread transmission. Everyone agreed that this was no longer a mere virus accident, and they needed to notify the police for investigation. Meanwhile, the counselor received a report that the antibodies had been found. He then made a secret call, stating that the antibodies had appeared and that he had done all he could. Now, the rest was up to them. Not long after, the director held a press conference, announcing that the virus's type had been identified and antibodies had been found. He advised the public not to panic. However, when the media asked questions about the virus's origin, he remained silent. The reporter at the scene knew that the authorities were withholding information. He privately approached Lee and presented his investigative results from the past few days. It turns out the sanatorium that had caught fire was not an isolated incident. 2 similar cases had occurred previously. The first to arrive on the scene was not the fire department, but an unknown medical organization. All these sanatoriums that had incidents were taken over by a shell company. This company had no employees, only a nominal legal representative. Meanwhile, several strangers entered the room where the host was staying. In the blink of an eye, the host disappeared, leaving behind only a pool of blood and an oxygen mask on the bed. As soon as Dr. Kim discovered the abduction, he immediately phoned Lee. Coincidentally, Lee was preparing to go upstairs to question the host. Hearing of the host's disappearance, Lee ran towards the hospital exit. Along the way, he encountered 2 flustered medical staff pushing a blood-stained bed towards the elevator. Lee knew something was wrong, but he was too late. He watched helplessly as the kidnappers loaded the host into a van and drove away. Lee quickly hopped in his car and gave chase, relayed the license plate number to his colleagues and asked them to track the van's location. Strangely, during his pursuit, Lee was repeatedly blocked by an ambulance, eventually losing the van entirely. Soon after, via the plate number, the colleague managed to find the owner's information. The culprits turned out to be the loan shark gang who had previously sent the host to the sanatorium. They had also recognized the value of the host's antibodies and planned to abduct him in order to sell him at a high price. As they were gloating, they were suddenly blocked by an ambulance and knocked unconscious by the driver. When Lee located the van again through GPS, it was already empty. Luckily, there was a surveillance camera nearby. The footage showed the loan sharks, dressed in white gowns, knocking out the guard at the entrance and abducting the host. When they got into their car at the hospital entrance, the ambulance that had been blocking Lee's pursuit also started up. Clearly, this was premeditated. However, it was strange that the ambulance driver did not appear to be in cahoots with the loan sharks. The next morning, a passerby opened his unused warehouse and was scared by what he saw inside. Shortly after, numerous police officers arrived to search for clues outside the warehouse, but did not go inside. They were waiting for personnel from the disease control center. When Lee and the others entered the warehouse with masks, they saw 3 bodies tied up. 2 were the lone shark henchmen who had kidnapped the host, and the other was the antibody-carrying host himself. They had met a tragic fate after being hijacked by the ambulance driver the night before. Lee was devastated. This meant that there was no hope left for vaccine development, and his infected ex-wife would not be saved. As he looked at her, Lee could only assure her that he would find a way to save her. The news of the death of the antibody carrier quickly reached the ears of the high officials. They had no choice but to seek help from the World Virus Organization. Someone suggested a company called Global Life, which was said to have developed a super antibody. Before long, Mr. Johnson, the sales manager of Global Life, paid a visit to the Disease Control Center. The director personally welcomed him. Johnson stated that their company's super vaccine could resist this variant virus and could be supplied on a large scale in just 2 weeks. However, in exchange, Korea had to bear 50% of the research costs of the super vaccine. Although it was a large sum, the officials had to agree to the deal. Subsequently, the director held a press conference, announcing that they had jointly developed a super vaccine with Global Life, which could be used soon. Dr. Yoon saw the news and was so angry that he hit the table and shouted, "How is this possible?" He immediately summoned Dr. Kim and stated that the super vaccine was the result of his many years of painstaking research. He was certain that Global Life had stolen his achievement. Dr. Kim seemed depressed at this point, not because of the super vaccine, but because a nurse he had known for many years had just died of the virus. Yet Dr. Yoon didn't care at all. All he could think about was the super vaccine. Dr. Kim was disappointed in him and finally revealed that the person who discovered the super antibody was him, not Dr. Yoon. Exposed, an embarrassed and angry Dr. Yoon vowed to find out who had leaked the antibody data to Global Life. At this time, the autopsy report of the host finally came out. Upon careful examination, 2 of the 3 bodies were injected with the variant virus, resulting in organ infection and death. The remaining host had died of potassium chloride poisoning. But strangely, a considerable amount of bone marrow had been extracted from him before his death. The coroner said this required professional medical means and was not something an ordinary person could do. Lee remembered seeing Dr. Yoon in the host's room through the surveillance footage. It was very likely that he was the one who took the bone marrow. So he planned to confront Dr. Yoon, but the nurse said he hadn't come to work all day. Even Dr. Kim had disappeared without a trace. Later, Lee discovered a lot of research data about virus antibodies in Dr. Yoon's office computer. He realized that Dr. Yoon had developed a vaccine for the virus. Now that Dr. Yoon was missing, he was likely off making a deal with a buyer. Indeed, Dr. Yoon had arrived at the transaction site, but instead of a buyer, he was met by a terrifying professional assassin. While everyone was searching for clues, Dr. Kim, who had been missing for a while, suddenly returned to the hospital. He had become exceptionally weak and passed out at the elevator entrance. When Dr. Kim woke up, Lee asked him where he had been. Dr. Kim said that today was the funeral of a nurse colleague and he had gone to pay his respects. However, he was completely unaware of Dr. Yoon's development of the vaccine. At this time, Johnson, the sales representative from the Life Company, had negotiated deals with the authorities. According to data reports, other countries had also experienced virus outbreaks, but it was most severe locally with over 1,000 infected individuals. The counselor casually asked if other countries had purchased the vaccine. Johnson regretfully stated that the virus had not spread enough in those areas. Lee, unaware that Dr. Yoon was dead, called the director, requesting an order to apprehend Dr. Yoon, who carried the antibody vaccine. However, the director revealed that the government had already signed a vaccine purchase agreement with Global Life, and whether they could find Dr. Yoon was no longer important. But Lee didn't want to give up, because more people would be infected and lose their lives during these following 2 weeks. As feared, Lee received a notice from the hospital saying that his ex-wife's condition had begun to deteriorate rapidly. Rushing to the hospital, he met Dr. Kim, who told him his ex-wife was in the emergency room and to prepare himself mentally. Simultaneously, Dr. Yoon's body was finally discovered, his death identical to that of the host. It was probably the same group's doing. Shortly after, one also arrived at the scene. The car had been cleaned thoroughly. Not only was the virus vaccine gone, but even the mobile phone and car monitoring devices had vanished. Sitting outside the operating room, Lee almost collapsed when he learned that Dr. Yoon had died and the virus antibody had disappeared. This meant that the last glimmer of hope to cure his ex-wife was shattered. He was then called into the operating room by a doctor and watched in despair as his ex-wife stopped breathing. Lee broke down in tears, feeling that his previous efforts to find the vaccine were meaningless. After the funeral for his ex-wife, Lee drowned his sorrow with alcohol. Just then, the reporter who had been investigating the truth about the virus found Lee and told him he had made a significant discovery. 2 years ago, a domestic biotech company had applied for the patent for a super vaccine, but due to tax issues, it was sued by an attorney, Koch, a nominal legal representative of the shell company. Consequently, the biotech company was forced to sell the vaccine patent to Global Life. The reporter had already investigated that Koch was the hidden owner of several sanatoriums that had caught fire, and these sanatoriums had all conducted live experiments with the mutated virus. Now, Global Life was selling the super antibody vaccine, and this was undoubtedly linked to Koch in numerous ways. Lee appreciated the reporter's tireless pursuit of the truth about the virus. He then returned to his office and reviewed the clues again. In the bus video, he noticed the driver who had hit Lee had been secretly following the host from the moment he escaped from the sanatorium, ensuring that the host could spread the virus. After the number of infections reached a certain scale and could spread on its own, they chose to kill the host and silence him. Lee shared his thoughts that the group using the host to spread the virus was likely trying to make huge profits through the vaccine. The Global Life company, the only one with the vaccine, was the prime suspect. So he ordered his team to find any evidence linking the shell company where Koch was located to the Global Life company. Compared to Lee, the reporter had a more straightforward investigative approach. He went to Global Life's office and expressed interest in interviewing Johnson, the sales manager. The visit to the office was successful, but before the interview could start, a group photo on the desk caught his attention. The reporter quickly took a photo of it with his phone as evidence. When Johnson entered the office, he found the reporter missing and saw the photo on the desk was of him and Koch, proving they had known each other for some time. Realizing this, Johnson called Koch, stating that the reporter might know about their relationship. Koch was decisive, immediately contacting the assassin, instructing him to deal with the reporter that day. Unaware of the impending danger, the reporter called Lee and arranged to meet in the evening to discuss in detail. But when Lee arrived at the agreed location, the reporter was suddenly stabbed in the abdomen by a dark figure and fell unconscious. Lee, who was not far away, was hit over the head and knocked unconscious. When he woke up, there were 2 bodies at the scene. Besides the reporter, the assassin was dead on the scene. As Lee was in shock, a police car approached from the distance. Instinctively, he ran in the opposite direction. After a while, Lee found himself in a shopping mall bathroom, his mind filled with confusion. It took him a long time to calm down. The police had just arrived and Lee had no choice but to run because he didn't understand why his hands were covered in blood. He was certain the police would identify him as the killer. Once he confirmed the police weren't following, Lee washed the blood off his hands, took off his blood-stained jacket, and hurriedly left in a taxi. The officer quickly arrived at the crime scene. They found the murder weapon and discovered Lee's work ID in the deceased reporter's car. The officer immediately listed him as a suspect and ordered his men to match the fingerprints on the dagger. Using the location data from Lee's phone, they found he was near the disease control center. The officer led his team there quickly. At this time, the colleague at the disease control center received a text from Lee asking him to come out. As Lee was about to explain some things, the officer and his team arrived. Lee had no choice but to turn around and run, quickly getting into a bus. The officer once again tracked Lee's position. But when he stopped the bus, Lee had already escaped, leaving his phone in a passenger's bag. The officer was furious and returned to the disease control center to question the colleague about what Lee had said. The colleague said that Lee hadn't even started speaking before the police arrived. He asked what crime Lee had committed. Upon learning that Lee was suspected of murder, all the staff expressed their disbelief. Right then, the officer received a call. The fingerprints on the murder weapon had been identified as Lee's. He issued a warrant for his arrest. Meanwhile, Lee was still trying to figure out what clues the reporter had discovered that led to his tragic death. So he went to the newspaper office where the reporter worked and collected all the investigative materials related to the virus from the desk. At this moment, the newspaper editor received news of Lee's warrant. But before he could do anything, Lee, sensing something was wrong, hastily left. Subsequently, he arrived at an internet cafe and began to sort through the reporter's information. Ultimately, he found a group photo in his online albums. Lee immediately understood everything. He also discovered that the sanatorium, which had been burnt down 2 years ago, was actually a research institute for global life. Just then, 2 security guards entered the internet cafe. Sensing trouble, Lee immediately sneaked away. He found out he was wanted for arrest from a walkie-talkie. Regardless, Lee didn't care. He was determined to uncover the truth. Now it was clear that Koch maintained both the sanatorium used for human experiments and global life that sold the vaccine. The previous murder cases could very well be his orchestrations, but Lee didn't have any solid evidence. He planned to call and test the waters. However, on his way to the phone booth, something strange happened. A man in the white coat seemed off. After a light cough, he held his head and walked into the center of the road. He showed no intention of avoiding the oncoming vehicles and just wanted to end his life. Meanwhile, at a Congress meeting, the counselor received a call from his son, but the voice that came was from a traffic police officer. It turns out the man in the white coat was the counselor's son. Lee found the man odd but didn't dwell on it. He went straight to the phone booth and dialed Koch's number. He blamed Koch for killing the reporter and framed it on him. Koch didn't deny it. After he arranged 2 assassins to deal with the reporter that day, the foreign assassin killed the other one because he was already under police surveillance and no longer useful. After that, the assassin placed the dagger in Lee's hand to frame him and divert the police's attention. Koch said that everyone was like a cogwheel. When the large wheel turns, the small wheel has to follow. This made Lee realize that perhaps what he discovered was just the tip of the iceberg. There must be more people involved in the crime. Subsequently, he noticed a familiar figure in Koch's group photo who didn't show his face. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was Dr. Kim, wondering if he was also involved. Trying to figure out the truth, Lee quietly came to the central hospital, unaware that he had been exposed, and the police were quickly approaching. Lee sneaked into Dr. Kim's office, wanting to examine his computer data, but he was caught red-handed by Dr. Kim. Lee asked him about his relationship with Global Life and showed him the group photo. Dr. Kim looked shocked. Just as he was about to speak, he received a call from the officer. After learning that he was there to arrest someone, he immediately informed Lee. With no other choice, Lee had to make a run for his shitty life. However, there were people at the stairway. He had to run towards the rooftop. This was clearly a dead end. Lee was soon surrounded by the police. Perhaps due to the excessive excitement, his eyes started bleeding. This was a symptom of the virus infection. It turned out that after he was knocked out that day, the assassin had injected him with the mutated virus. Now, with intense exercise and mental stimulation, the virus cells began to multiply rapidly, causing him to pass out. Subsequently, Lee was rushed to the hospital for emergency treatment. The officer could only wait for Lee's recovery. From being a wanted criminal, Lee had become an infected patient, once again becoming the focus of news media. Johnson from Global Life called Koch, telling him that the vaccine would start being distributed tomorrow, an excellent opportunity to increase influence. Before that, it would be best to get rid of Lee tonight. But Lee was currently under the close watch of the police. The only person who could kill him now was Dr. Kim. It turned out that he and Koch were indeed in cahoots. Back at the hospital, Dr. Kim contemplated for a long time. Taking advantage of the sleeping guard, he quietly entered Lee's room and injected the lethal potion given by Koch into Lee's IV bag. Lee seemed to sense something and tried to raise his hand to stop it, but he was too weak to resist. The next day, as planned, the super antibody vaccine began to be supplied on a large scale. The first batch was 15 million doses, prioritized for medical personnel, the elderly, and children. However, at this time, Koch was a bit panicked. The officer had come to talk to him. Although there was no direct evidence, he had clearly become a suspect. His main concern now was whether Lee was dead or not. So he called the assassin and asked him to confirm whether Dr. Kim had completed the task. At this time, Lee was actually not dead. Last night, what Dr. Kim injected into him was not lethal poison, but a treatment for the mutated virus. He also told Lee that someone wanted to kill him, and he needed to leave the hospital quickly. Just then, Dr. Kim saw the assassin in the elevator and knew that Lee was in danger, so he hurriedly moved Lee out of the hospital. This not only alerted the assassin, but also the police. After Dr. Kim brought Lee to a safe area under the other's questioning, he finally confessed some things. It's revealed that Dr. Kim developed the mutated virus on his own for the purpose of developing a super antibody vaccine. If successful, it could protect humanity from the many mutated viruses. Unfortunately, the higher-ups believed that the research cycle was long and cost-effective, so they cut off the research funding. Dr. Kim could only cooperate with Global Life, but he knew nothing about their greediness to spread the virus for profit-making. Lee scolded Dr. Kim for being too naive, asking him if he knew how many people had died because of this. Then he stormed off in anger. Dr. Kim muttered to himself that he would take responsibility to the end, and then returned to the hospital. The surveillance in the hospital corridor was destroyed by the assassin, so the officer only saw Lee and Dr. Kim leave separately, followed by the assassin searching for someone. There was no evidence to prove that Lee was taken away by Dr. Kim, making it impossible for the officer to act. Afterward, Lee was at a private clinic. The clinic owner was his best friend, so he didn't have to worry about his location being disclosed. Lee wanted to confirm if his infection was cured, so he drew a vial of blood and gave it for confirmation. He also remembered a conversation from last night. Lee asked Dr. Kim why he had saved him. Dr. Kim told him that the current super antibody vaccine still had flaws. Some people died during clinical trials, but the exact cause hadn't been identified. Dr. Kim hoped Lee could stop the mass vaccination. Meanwhile, the news reported that the number of people vaccinated domestically had reached 10 million, and the situation seemed to be stabilizing. However, strange things started to happen. A patient in the ward, infected with the virus, stole a syringe while the nurse was preparing an IV and stabbed himself in the neck, dying from excessive blood loss. Later, the same nurse jumped off the hospital rooftop. Dr. Kim received the news of the nurse's death and murmured that it has begun. In the following days, numerous videos of people ending their own lives inexplicably circulated online. On the other hand, Lee's test results came back quickly, showing negative, indicating that the virus special effects had worked. But he was worried about the news reports on TV. There had been dozens of suicides that day. The connection between them and the reason for the suicides was unknown. Koch, who was watching the news, received a call from Johnson. He was asked to capture Dr. Kim to improve the antibody vaccine. Apparently, Johnson had figured out that the deaths were related to the vaccine. Koch remembered Dr. Kim's warning a few days ago about deaths in the vaccine's clinical trials. Yet Johnson claimed that the vaccine had already entered mass production. It had been nearly 100% successful in animals, so he thought the problems were minor. Dr. Kim felt Johnson's approach was irresponsible and declared that he was quitting from the partnership. But Johnson didn't agree and immediately dispatched the assassin to capture Dr. Kim back. Knowing he was in danger, Dr. Kim quickly took the antibody samples, intending to continue his research in a secluded location. However, he barely made it out of the hospital before encountering the assassin sent to capture him. Upon seeing the mass suicide incidents on TV, Lee remembered Dr. Kim mentioning flaws in the super antibody. He immediately rushed back to the disease control center, disregarding his status as a fugitive, and ordered his colleagues to investigate any evidence linking the suicides to the antibody vaccine. He then went in search of Dr. Kim, who was now the only one capable of improving the vaccine and containing the situation. When Lee arrived at the hospital, he happened to run into Dr. Kim, who was avoiding the assassin. He helped Dr. Kim escape the hospital, but they ran into the officer at the entrance. Lee shouted that the spectacled assassin was the suspect. The officer, who had been watching him for a while, immediately ordered his men to apprehend the assassin. He stayed behind to arrest Lee, unaware that Dr. Kim had already fled. Dr. Kim was now on a bus, reminiscing about his decision to collaborate with Global Life. They had promised that this would be humanity's hope, but later engaged in abhorrent actions. So he planned to hide from the company and develop the antibody vaccine alone in an abandoned lab. This was where a failed case had occurred. A test subject who had been injected with the super antibody died mysteriously by running into a wall. Meanwhile, Lee was brought in for questioning by the officer. He confessed about the virus spread, the vaccine release, and the crimes committed by Koch and Global Life. The priority now was to find Dr. Kim and have him improve the vaccine. However, the officer could not believe Lee's extraordinary tale without solid evidence. Just then, a subordinate reported that someone had delivered the reporter's phone. It contained a recording of a phone call made before his death and a conversation between the two assassins after his death, proving Lee had no connection to the murder. As a result, Lee was released. In fact, the phone had been sent to the police station by Koch, who knew that Dr. Kim would likely contact Lee during the process of improving the vaccine. They couldn't afford to have Lee remain in jail, as it might mean they'd never find Dr. Kim. At this point, the officer began to believe Lee's theory as well, preparing to focus his efforts on Koch and the foreign assassin. Lee, now free of suspicion, immediately returned to the disease control center to inform his superiors about the side effects of the super antibody. This news gave the director a massive headache, because over 20 million people had already received the super vaccine. If they were to disclose this information, it would undoubtedly cause widespread panic. Moreover, not everyone who received the vaccine was getting sick. Unless there was solid evidence, he had no choice but to remain silent. In the subsequent press conference, the director had to lie against his better judgment, declaring that the recent suicides had no connection to the super antibody and advising the public not to panic. Other than finding Dr. Kim, Lee's most important task now was to identify any common characteristics among those who terminated themselves. The meticulous IT girl knew that Lee had lost his phone and thoughtfully bought him a new one. Not long after, the autopsy report of one of the suicide victims came in. The deceased's intracranial pressure had increased, causing brain tissue damage, accompanied by complications in the nervous system. Even if they hadn't terminated themselves, they would have experienced severe headaches. Furthermore, the deceased had suffered from a lung disease. Lee thought lung disease could be one of the triggering factors. At that moment, a colleague reported that one of the suicide victims had not been vaccinated with the super antibody. Lee found this suspicious and asked his men to investigate the people around the female patient to see if they had experienced similar conditions. As a result, one discovered from her social media account that the patient's boyfriend had died in a car accident a few days earlier. Lee immediately remembered that he had personally witnessed that car accident. The victim's expression at the time looked like he had wanted to end his own life. One was bewildered because the super antibody had not been available at the time of the accident. The colleague then exclaimed that the man was the son of the counselor. So Lee immediately found the counselor and told him that his son's death may have been intentional, likely due to side effects after secretly injecting the super antibody. The counselor remembered that before the super antibody went on the market, he had received 10 doses from Johnson as a private gift. His son had taken 2, probably for himself and his girlfriend, which would explain why there were no vaccination records for them. However, the counselor couldn't admit this in person and warned Lee not to misunderstand his words. Lee met a dead end here, but later received a call from Dr. Kim. Upon learning the doctor's location, he hurriedly drove over. However, the assassin had arrived before him. Dr. Kim, under the pretense of organizing his materials, bolted outside, but he was no match for a professional assassin and was quickly knocked unconscious and forced into a car. Luckily, Lee arrived at that moment. He jumped onto the car window like a madman, waking the unconscious Dr. Kim. Seeing his target escaping, the assassin was about to give chase when the officer arrived with his team. The assassin had to abandon Dr. Kim and fled. Not long after, the officer came over to inform that the foreign assassin had been caught. He reminded Lee that there must be a mole on his side because the assassin knew Dr. Kim's hideout as soon as Dr. Kim contacts him. Lee was alerted. He returned to his office and recalled what the officer had said about a new phone cloning technology. By entering a specific code into a phone, one could receive messages or calls from it on another device. So Lee tried calling his number from a landline. As his phone rang, the IT girl sitting outside sneakily took out another phone and began answering it. Lee's new phone was also gifted by the IT girl. No wonder the assassin could always arrive on scene in time to sabotage Lee's plans. However, he chose not to confront her right away, as the officer suggested they could use this to lure out the mastermind. Shortly after, one brought some good news. By examining the cases of the suicide victims, they discovered most of them had a history of influenza A. Lee immediately sought out Dr. Kim for confirmation. The doctor responded that it was highly likely. The super vaccine could reactivate dormant influenza A immune cells, ultimately affecting the brain. Lee asked why he didn't suffer any side effects despite having had influenza A and being vaccinated with the super vaccine. Dr. Kim revealed that what he had been injected with was not the super antibody vaccine, but an antiviral made from the bone marrow of the virus host. The bone marrow was taken previously by Dr. Yoon, who snuck into the host's room. However, Dr. Kim found it out and replaced it when Dr. Yoon wasn't around. Since Lee was unaffected, his blood antibodies might be able to improve the super vaccine. Dr. Kim decided to give it a try. The results came out quickly. The injection of it into mice carrying the influenza A virus indeed caused severe side effects. However, combining Lee's antibodies with the super vaccine presented no issues. Lee then reported this finding to the higher-ups. The counselor, who by now harbored deep resentment towards Global Life, had previously confronted Johnson, but was met with denial and an aggressive threat from Johnson, warning him not to act recklessly. Now that the counselor had proof, he decided to reveal the truth to the public. The CDC director promptly held a press conference, urging those who had had influenza A to stop receiving the super antibody. Before long, Lee's phone received a message from Dr. Kim. The new super antibody had been developed, and he was urged to come over immediately. In the near distance, the IT girl also received the same information. She reported his whereabouts to her boss, Koch. As before, Koch arrived at the destination before Lee. Little did he know that this time it was a trap. Only a phone was in the lab. The officer had been waiting for a long time. Lee himself had never left the disease control center, having only arranged for someone to bring the phone into the ambush circle. The IT girl was caught red-handed, and the police quickly took her away. Inside the interrogation room, Koch had taken the bait this time. He was caught red-handed, and the foreign assassin had also implicated Koch. As a professional killer, he was initially unwilling to confess. However, he never expected Koch to bribe the police to attempt to kill him in the interrogation room. Luckily, his combat skills were strong, and he barely escaped with his life. As a result, the terrified assassin confessed all of Koch's crimes. But Koch, despite being in such an unfavorable position, still had a smile on his face. He assured the officer that he would be released without charges. It turned out he had previously approached the counselor with his crime information, threatening that if anything happened to him, all his crimes would be made public. Sure enough, not long after, Koch was released because the prosecution withdrew the charges against him. In anger, Lee swore that he definitely wouldn't let him escape like this. It wasn't long before Dr. Kim sent a message that the new super antibody vaccine had been successfully developed. This time, the clinical test he conducted on himself showed no negative effects. Dr. Kim handed the formula information to Lee, hoping he could promote it as soon as possible. After repeated confirmations, the new super antibody was finally put on the market. However, Global Life still insisted that there was nothing wrong with their vaccine, but someone had to take the blame for these losses. Unexpectedly, the counselor stepped forward to apologize. He admitted in front of the press that due to his mistake, there was an error in the production of the vaccine. It had nothing to do with Global Life, and he decided to resign from all his positions. This was a move of desperation because the president had instructed him to do so. It turned out that Johnson's network had penetrated even higher levels. At this time, Koch also learned about this outcome. Just as he was gloating, a man in black suddenly appeared and injected a tube of poison into his body, causing him to meet his deserved end. 2 months later, Lee received an email from Dr. Kim. He had once again used his own body to experiment with a new variant virus, sending out all the experimental data. However, Dr. Kim lost his life in the process. He hoped that in this way, he could atone for the mistakes he had once made. During this time, Lee had also compiled evidence of Global Life's crimes, but just before he was about to send it to the top authorities, he chose to give up. He knew that it would be difficult to bring them down through these official channels. Perhaps using alternative methods would be more effective. Meanwhile, the Global Life Company was holding a high-level meeting. It turned out that in their eyes, the entire nation was nothing more than an experimental site for their super vaccine. The executives laughed and discussed which country would be their next experimental target. In the company's experimental vault, an array of terrifying virus samples were stored. The open-ended finale of this drama was rather controversial. The villains behind the scenes did not receive their deserved punishment, and instead, the situation seemed to escalate. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.